The Fed uses three conventional tools to deal with the economy. The first being the reserve requirement, which is the amount of reserves banks must hold. The discount rate, which is the rate that banks have to pay the feds. And the third and most important one is the open market operations. It's so important that it has its own committee, and it's the purchasing and selling of government securities. An example of an open market operation is the Fed's purchasing bank securities, and in turn, banks would receive an increase in reserves. This will cause a lower in interest rates, which we'll discuss later.
The cycle of the product market can be seen in this example of households and firms. Households work in firms for an income in which they then spend on goods and services provided by the firms.
We have our product market, and this we already know as our neoclassical model, which is the intersection of both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we know that either one of these curves can shift in or out. However, in relation to the money market, we are primarily concerned with the movement of aggregate demand. So here we have aggregate supply. We are more concerned with either shifting demand out and lowering the interest rate, making it easier for consumers to get loans from banks. Or we can increase the interest rate, effectively decreasing aggregate demand and making it harder to get a loan. That being said, if we raise aggregate demand by lowering interest rates, despite what we see occurring in the product market, we will have the price of money, or let's draw that as price of money, will decrease because it is easier to get loans. Now when we shift aggregate demand curve down or decreasing it, the price of money increases because it's more difficult to get a loan. We have our money market. On the y-axis we have the interest rate, and on our x-axis we have our quantity of money. So we have our demand for money, or D sub n, and this is determined by the banks. The supply of money is determined by the Fed. Now, this can either shift in, it can shift supply of money in, or it can shift out, effectively increasing the interest rate or decreasing the interest rate by changing the amount of reserves that are available to a bank.
Now here's an example of an open market purchase.
Now here we have we'll show the effect of a expansionary monetary policy on the money market, but we also know that expansionary monetary policy is the open market purchase. So, as we have here, we draw our money market. We have our supply for money, and we have our demand for money. So what happens is, for expansionary monetary policy and open market purchase, we are increasing this money supply. So we shift it here. As you can see, the effect of this open market purchase is we lower the interest rate, therefore making it easier to lend, or decreasing the price of money. At the effect of expansionary monetary policy or an open market purchase on the product market. Well, we know the product market is just, if we look at our neoclassical model, it's just aggregate supply and aggregate demand. at this equilibrium. But if we are practicing expansionary monetary policy, or we're making open market purchases, we are increasing C. Now, if we increase C, we're increasing our expenditure function, which is also known as aggregate demand. So that will shift here. However, the effect of this open market purchase is that we cause our equilibrium to shift up from this original equilibrium to this new equilibrium. As you can see, GDP increases, but our price level increases. This is known as inflation.
And here's an example of an open market sale.
The goal of contractionary monetary policy is you want to increase the interest rate. So if we draw our money market, we have our demand for money and our supply for money. So what the Fed will do, well, before I get ahead of myself, it's we have our initial equilibrium before we enact our policy. But if our goal is to increase the interest rate, well, as we know, the Fed will lower the amount of the money supply. So let's say our curve will shift up and in. The effect of this on the money market is the goal of contractionary monetary policy. You have your interest rate increasing. The effect of contractionary monetary policy or an open market sale on the product market. So what happens is, as I mentioned earlier, we lower C. And by lowering C, we lower our expenditure function, or we lower aggregate demand. As you can see on the graph, we lower it to this point. However, the effect of an open market sale is you cause GDP to drop. We know this as we cause seemingly more unemployment. Example of wanting to lower the interest rate would be seen in an inflationary gap. Now, an inflationary gap, as we know, is when your equilibrium is above potential by this gap. The difference between y sub f and y star. Now, as we mentioned, you would want to use open market sales or contractionary monetary policy. So what you would want to do is you would want to decrease the supply of money, or you want to make the interest rate higher. And as I've mentioned before, when you decrease the supply of money or increase the interest rate, you are decreasing C. C, as I've mentioned before, lowers aggregate demand. However, the relationship is very indirect. So the first initial shift would shift aggregate demand here. So if we do a second round of it, we would decrease the supply of money even higher, which will shift our equilibrium a little lower.